2025-36. My name is Michael Hammer, and I am the Commission's designated presiding officer for this hearing. Let's go ahead and take appearances, please.
Good morning, Mr. Hammer. Daniel Solander, representing Rocky Mountain Power. I have with me at the council table the company's two witnesses, Mr. Robert Meredith and Mr. William Como.
And good morning. I'm Justin Jetter with the Utah Attorney General's Office. I'm here today representing the Utah Division of Public Utilities, and with me at council table is Division Witness Robert A. Davis.
Good morning. My name is Stephen Snar. I'm an Assistant Attorney General representing the Office of Consumer Services. With me at the table is Cheryl Murray, one of the witnesses for the office. We also have available Jacob Thomas on the telephone, who is one of our witnesses who will be participating telephonically with us to the extent that may be necessary.
Steve Meekum, representing ChargePoint, Inc., and our witness, Mr. James Ellis, will be participating by telephone.
Good morning. Sophie Hayes on behalf of Utah Clean Energy. With me at council table is Ms. Sarah Wright, who is one of our witnesses, and also appearing will be Mr. Kevin Emerson, who will be making a statement in support of the stipulation.
Good morning. Jennifer Gardner, representing Western Resource Advocates, and with me at the council table is Kenneth L. Wilson, who is our witness in this phase of the docket. Thank you.
Okay. In terms of the order of the presentation of evidence, I thought we'd start with
Excuse me, Mr. Hammer. I was under the impression that Mr. Joe Halso might also be appearing via the phone. Did he make an appearance?
No.
Okay.
In terms of the order of the presentation of evidence, I thought we'd start with the company, since it's the company's application. My instinct would be to then proceed with the division and the office, and then turn to the interveners. I don't know if you have a preference as to who goes first among the interveners.
One thing some of the parties had discussed, Mr. Hammer, was maybe doing testimony in support of the stipulation first from all parties.
Okay.
So the company would go, and then the division, and so on. And then after that is concluded, then moving on to the time of use rates portion.
That's fine with me. We'll still need to decide who goes first among the interveners. Mr. Meekum, are you comfortable going first?
I'm fine. We're really just presenting the testimony and putting it on the record and
Okay.
supporting the stipulation. So.
Okay. And then we'll proceed to Ms. Hayes and Ms. Gardner. Okay. And do we anticipate there will be cross-examination? I think there will likely be on the time of use portion, no? Okay, then it's probably best, at least for that portion, we'll have the witnesses take the witness stand. I'll allow counsel to decide whether you want your witnesses to take the stand when we testify as to the stipulation. Anything else before we begin? All right, Mr. Solander, please call your first witness.
Thank you. Rocky Mountain Power calls William Como in support of the stipulation, and also he'll be testifying regarding the company's proposed electric vehicle time of use program that led up to the stipulation.
Mr. Como, do you swear to tell the truth?
Yes.
Thank you. And I'm sorry if my instructions weren't clear. You're welcome to take the stand if you like, but during this first portion, if you'd prefer to stay seated, and if no one has any objection, that's fine as well. Go ahead, Mr. Solander.
Thank you. Would you please state and spell your name for the record?
William Como, WILLIAM, COMEAU.
And what is your current position with Rocky Mountain Power?
I'm the Director of Customer Solutions.
And as the Director of Customer Solutions, did you file direct testimony in Phase 3 of this proceeding?
I did.
And do you have any corrections or additions to your testimony or the exhibits that you filed with that testimony?
I do not.
So if I asked you those same questions today, each of your answers would be the same?
That's correct.
I'd move at this time the admission of Mr. Como's direct testimony and exhibits accompanying it.
They're admitted.
Thank you. And Mr. Como, did you also participate with all the other parties in the negotiation of a stipulation regarding the company's electric vehicle incentive program?
I did.
Incentive program?
I did.
And do you have a statement in support of the stipulation that was agreed to by the company and all of the parties?
I do.
Please proceed.
Okay. Okay, well, on May 10th, 2016, the company met with interested parties to provide background information on electric vehicle adoption in Utah and discuss concepts for consideration in developing a plug-in electric vehicle program. On September 12th, 2016, the company filed an application to implement programs authorized by the Sustainable Transportation and Energy Plan Act, including a request for authorization of funding for a plug-in electric vehicle incentive program, and a proposal to host a series of working group discussions with interested parties to advise on the development of a time-of-use program in conjunction with the plug-in electric vehicle incentive program. On January 31st, 2017, after holding several working group discussions, the company filed its supplemental application to implement plug-in electric vehicle incentives and time-of-use programs, together with supporting testimony. The proposed plug-in electric vehicle program offers incentives for participation in time-of-use rates, non-residential and multifamily AC Level 2 and DC fast chargers, and a custom offering for grant-based projects and partnerships. The proposed time-of-use program offers customers with plug-in electric vehicles the choice of different rate options that promote off-peak charging. The time-of-use program also incentivizes customers to participate in a load research study, which will help the company to better understand charging behaviors for plug-in electric vehicles. On April 6, 2017, intervening parties submitted direct testimony in response to the company's supplemental application and proposed programs. On April 27th, 2017, the company filed rebuttal testimony with revisions to its proposed programs based on recommendations contained in intervening parties' direct testimony. On May 16th, 2017, the parties filed a stipulation and partial settlement agreement of Phase 3 issues. Parties to the stipulation have agreed on all components of the plug-in electric vehicle incentive and time-of-use programs as described in the stipulation, except for the time-of-use rate options and on-off-peak time periods. The company shall guarantee against an increase of customer costs on the time-of-use rate schedule for the first 12 months of enrollment. If the total annual energy costs incurred in the time-of-use rate schedule exceed 10% over what costs would have been for the same period under Schedule 1 rates, the net difference will be credited on the customer's bill following the last month of the one-year commitment. Parties agreed to the proposed maximum and initially offered incentive levels described in the company's rebuttal testimony for AC Level 2 and DC fast chargers. The company agrees to meet with interested parties after the first year of operation to evaluate applications and awarded incentives, and evaluate whether changes to outreach or incentives are warranted. The company will also provide a status update to interested parties in the first quarter of 2018. The time-of-use load research study will be limited to residential customers who indicate they have an AC Level 2 charger and will require participation for 1 year. The company, 1 year. The company agrees to keep the load research meters in place beyond 1 year and collect data for study participants for the duration of the time-of-use program. The company further agrees to meet with interested parties to review initial load research study results between month 9 and 12 of the study period to discuss what actions and costs, if any, would be necessary to ensure a meaningful study. The signing parties believe the stipulation is in the public interest and respectfully request the Commission approve the stipulation as filed.
That concludes your statement?
It does.
Mr. Como is available for questions from the Commission.
No questions from the division.
No questions from the office.
No questions.
No questions.
And no questions.
Thank you, Mr. Como.
Thank you.
Mr. Solander, does the company have any other witnesses with respect to the stipulation?
With respect to the stipulation, no. Thank
Okay.
you.
Mr. Jeter?
Thank you. The division would like to call and have sworn in Mr. Robert A. Davis.
Good morning, Mr. Davis.
Morning.
Do you swear to tell the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Mr. Davis, would you please state your name and occupation for the record?
Name's Robert A. Davis. I'm a utility analyst for the Division of Public Utilities.
Thank you. And in the course of your employment with the division, have you had the opportunity to review the filings and pre-filed testimony in this docket?
I have.
And have you also had an opportunity to review the, I believe it's titled Stipulation and Partial Settlement Agreement that's been filed and signed by the parties in this docket?
I have.
And what is your opinion of the settlement stipulation?
The parties reached a settlement on all issues except the time of use rates and time periods for the pilot. The division signed and supports the stipulation.
And do you believe approval of the stipulation as it's been presented to the commission would be just, reasonable, and in the public interest?
I do.
Thank you. I have no further questions, and Mr. Davis is available for cross-examination.
Does any party have any questions for Mr. Davis?
None.
None?
Thank you, Mr. Jeter. Thank you, Mr. Davis. Mr. Snar?
Yes, on behalf of the office, we'd like to present Cheryl Murray as a witness, and we can do that right here at the table if that's all right.
Of course. Ms. Murray, do you swear to tell the truth?
Yes.
Thank you.
Please state your name, business address, and for whom you work.
My name is Cheryl Murray. My address is 160 East, 300 South, Salt Lake City. I work for the Office of Consumer Services.
With respect to this case and this particular phase, did you prepare evidence or testimony to be submitted?
Yes, I did.
And did you submit direct testimony consisting of 18 pages filed on April 6, 2017, as well as rebuttal testimony consisting of 14 pages filed on April 26, 2017, and surrebuttal testimony consisting of 6 pages filed on May 16, 2017?
Yes.
Do you have any changes to your testimony at this time?
Yes, I do.
With respect to direct testimony, could you tell us what changes to be made?
Certainly. Page 3, line 49. Change 2 witnesses to 1 witness. The corrected line should read, "The office has 1 witness in addition to myself." Page 3, strike lines 50 through 52, which reads, 1, Mr. James Daniel will address the rate design and other elements of rate options 1 and 2, components of the company's proposed EV-TOU pilot. On that same page, line 53, strike the number 2. On page 15, line 313, strike everything after the word yes, which would be as identified in the direct testimony of Mr. Daniel at lines 261 to 269. On page 15, line 314, capitalize the letter I in the first word, in.
Do you have any changes to your rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I do.
Could you present them?
Yes, page 8, line 178, remove the word our and replace with the word a. Page 14, line 299, strike the words as proposed by the office in direct testimony. Those are all my changes.
Thank you. Do you have a statement in support of the settlement that has been referenced?
Yes, I do.
Could you present that at this time?
Yes,
Did you participate in the settlement discussions?
I did.
Does the office support the settlement as filed?
Yes, we do.
You have some testimony to provide in support of that settlement.
Yes. In my direct testimony, I recommended several minor modifications to the tariffs, which the company accepted in its rebuttal testimony. Since that time, through discussion and negotiations, further modifications have been made to the tariffs and are included in the tariffs attached to the stipulation. Some of the important tariff changes include the following. As originally filed, Schedule 120 in the Special Conditions sections for AC Level 2 Charger Prescriptive Incentive and DC Fast Charger Prescriptive Incentive indicated that customers who received an incentive may be required to consent to provide charger usage data. In Schedule 21 filed with the stipulation on May 15, consent to provide charger usage data is now identified as a requirement for receiving an incentive. A similar requirement now also exists for customer projects and partnerships incentive, if applicable. In direct testimony, the office recommended that the company should create a new tariff related specifically to load research study participants. In the rebuttal testimony of Mr. Robert Meredith, the company accepted the recommendation and provided such a tariff. In negotiations, the parties agreed to that tariff language with certain modifications which are included in Schedule Number 121 attached to the stipulation. In addition to the tariff changes, the settlement stipulation contains several key elements important to the office, such as the additional reporting requirements memorialized in Exhibit D EV TOU pilot report requirements, agreement regarding ongoing meetings, and load research issues. In my direct testimony, I suggested that additional technical conferences be required to provide specific information regarding outreach and education, and to explain the results of the company's RFP. In the stipulation, parties agreed to meet to discuss a number of issues of concern to the office and others. Although not set as a technical conference, the office is satisfied that this will provide the opportunity to obtain the information we were seeking. I would also note that these meetings will provide an opportunity to explore whether changes to the incentives are warranted and provide a forum to address some of the issues raised by parties that could not be included in the settled design of the program at this time. The design of the load research study is a major issue for the office. Our primary concern was that obtaining survey information from both Level 1 and Level 2 residential chargers would not provide statistically significant information without further stratification by type of charger. The stipulation requires that residential load research participants will be required to have AC Level 2 chargers. Limiting the load research study to only those with AC Level 2 chargers alleviates our concern and eliminates the need for additional stratification. Taken as a whole, the office believes that the stipulation is in the public interest and recommends that the commission approve it.
Does that conclude your statement?
Yes, it does.
At this time, we'd like to move the admission of exhibits that the office sponsors. There are 3 exhibits identified as direct, rebuttal, and surrebuttal testimony submitted by Cheryl Murray. We also have the direct testimony of Mr. Jacob Thomas and 1 exhibit. We would like to move those into evidence as well. His testimony primarily is directed at the issues that were addressed and resolved by way of the stipulation.
Thank you, Mr. Snarr. They're admitted. Does any party have any cross-examination for Ms. Murray on the stipulation? Anything else, Mr. Snarr, at this time?
Nothing else.
Thank you. Mr. Meekum.
Thank you, Mr. Hammer. Charge point would call Mr. James Ellis. Mr. Ellis, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I am having a hard time hearing all of the discussion, but I hear you.
Okay. We would ask that Mr. Ellis be sworn.
Mr. Ellis, this is the presiding officer, Michael Hammer. Do you swear to tell the truth today? Mr. Ellis, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
This is Michael Hammer, the presiding officer. Do you swear to tell the truth today?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Ellis, would you please state your name and business address for the record, please?
James Ellis. I reside at 6215 Robin Hill Road, Nashville, Tennessee.
Thank you. And what is your position at ChargePoint?
I am Director of Utility Solutions at ChargePoint.
And did you cause to be filed direct testimony consisting of 12 pages on April 6th of this year and surrebuttal testimony consisting of 3 pages dated May 16th of this year?
Yes, I did.
And if I were to ask you the questions that are in those exhibits, would they be the same today?
Yes, they are.
Thank you. And does ChargePoint support the stipulation?
ChargePoint supports the stipulation.
Thank you. And Mr. Hammer, I would move the admission of the 2 pieces of evidence, which I marked as ChargePoint Exhibit 1 and ChargePoint Exhibit 1SR.
They're admitted. Thank you.
Thank you. And if there are no questions for Mr. Ellis, I would ask that he be excused.
Does any party have any questions for Mr. Ellis?
The office has no questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ellis. You're excused.
The office would
Thank you.
ask. Excuse me.
Do you want Mr. Ellis to stay on the line?
No,
Okay.
pardon me.
Go ahead.
We have asked for the submission of Mr. Jacob Thomas's evidence. We didn't ask whether anyone wanted to cross-examine him, but we offer that as well.
Okay. Thank you. Does any party have any questions for that witness? All right. We'll proceed with Ms. Hayes then.
Thank you. Utah Clean Energy will call Mr. Kevin Emerson to the witness stand. Can he please be sworn before he sits?
Mr. Emerson, do you swear to tell the truth? Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Emerson. Will you please state your name and position for the record?
Yes, my name is Kevin Emerson. I am the Energy Efficiency Program Director for Utah Clean Energy.
Thank you. Will you please speak somewhat more slowly?
Glad to.
Thank you. Did you file direct testimony in this docket on April 6th?
Yes, I submitted direct testimony related to the electric vehicle infrastructure incentive on behalf of Utah Clean Energy and the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project as part of this docket.
And did you also participate in the settlement discussions that led to the settlement stipulation we are discussing this morning?
Yes, I did.
Do you have a statement you have prepared regarding that stipulation?
Yes, I do. Utah Clean Energy supports the settlement filed as part of Mr. Meredith's testimony on May 16th. Our main concern with regard to the company's proposed electric vehicle incentives was providing robust incentives for smart at-home vehicle charging. Analysis from Idaho National Laboratory shows that over 80% of charging is done at home. Charging during off-peak hours, which will largely take place at home and during the night, will have the least impact on the utility system. Therefore, Utah Clean Energy feels strongly that it is in the best interest of the system and also in the interest of fairness for residential customers that incentives for at-home level 2 charging infrastructure be thoroughly evaluated and included in future years. Ratepayers that live in apartments and condominiums should have the opportunity to charge at home, and Utah Clean Energy believes that given the increased complexity of installing electric vehicle charging infrastructure in a multifamily setting, that a higher incentive than the one proposed is likely needed for multifamily properties. To address our concerns regarding level 2 residential and multifamily charging infrastructure, the settlement includes a few things. Increased up to or maximum incentives in non-residential and DC fast charging electric vehicle infrastructure. It includes more explicit language indicating that multifamily properties are eligible for incentives through the non-residential DC fast charger and grant-based custom project categories. It includes a commitment from the company to provide a status update on program activity in the first quarter of 2018. And it includes a commitment from the company for the company to meet with interested parties after the first year of program operation to evaluate adding level 2 incentives for at-home charging and to evaluate increasing incentives for multifamily charging infrastructure.
Does that conclude your statement?
Yes.
Thank you. Utah Clean Energy at this time would move the admission of the direct testimony of Kevin Emerson, marked as Utah Clean Energy Exhibit 4.0, and would make Mr. Emerson available for questions.
It's admitted. And does any party have any questions for Mr. Emerson at this time? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Emerson. Anything else at this time, Ms. Hayes?
Not at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Gardner?
Thank you. Western Resource Advocates calls Kenneth L. Kenneth L. Wilson as our witness and would ask that he be sworn in at this time.
Mr. Wilson, do you swear to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Mr. Wilson, can you please state your name and business address for the record?
Kenneth L. Wilson, business address for Western Resource Advocates is 2260 Baseline Road, Suite 200, Boulder, Colorado 80302.
And Mr. Wilson, can you please state your position with Western Resource Advocates?
Yes, I'm the engineering fellow.
Did you file a copy of your CV in Phase 1 of this docket on November 9th, 2016, marked as WRA Exhibit 1.1?
Yes, I did.
And did you file direct testimony in Phase 3 of this docket on April 6th, 2017, marked as WRA Exhibit 2.0?
Yes.
Did you file rebuttal testimony also in Phase 3 on April 27th, 2017, marked as WRA Exhibit 3.0?
Yes.
And did you file surrebuttal testimony in this docket on May 16th, 2017, marked as WRA Exhibit 4.0?
Yes, I did.
And finally, did you also file an Exhibit A to Exhibit 4.0 on May 16th, 2017, entitled A Review of Alternative Rate Designs, authored by the Rocky Mountain Institute?
Yes.
And to the best of your knowledge, Mr. Wilson, is everything in your testimony true and correct?
It is. However, there's some clarification regarding a section of my surrebuttal that I would like to make when I testify to the rate structures, so I can do that a bit later.
Okay. And Mr. Wilson, was WRA a signatory to the settlement agreement filed with the Commission by Rocky Mountain Power on behalf of the settling parties on May 16th, 2017?
Yes, we were. The parties discussed numerous issues. WRA had two main issues that were addressed in the settlement. One was extending the length of the pilot in the way that Rocky Mountain Power discussed, and the second was to focus on level 2 chargers. And so both of those issues were taken care of in the settlement, and we are very comfortable signing it.
And Mr. Wilson, just one follow-up there. Do you believe that, to the best of your knowledge, that the settlement agreement is just, reasonable, and in the public interest?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. So at this time, WRA would move for the admission of all of Mr. Wilson's testimony, his CV, as well as Exhibit A.
They're admitted.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson is available for questions.
Does any party have any questions for Mr. Wilson at this time? Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Ms. Gardner, anything else?
Nope, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else from any party before we proceed to discussing the remaining issues, or I should say receiving testimony on the remaining issues?
If I didn't move so before, I'd move that the stipulation and partial settlement agreement of Phase 3 issues be entered into the record.
They're entered. Thanks. All right, then we'll proceed. Mr. Solander, please call your first witness.
Thank you. The company calls Mr. Robert Meredith in support of the company's proposed time of use pricing programs.
Mr. Meredith, do you swear to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Meredith.
Morning.
Could you please state and spell your name for the record?
Robert M. Meredith, ROBERTMMEREDITH.
And what is your current position with Pacific Corp?
Manager, Pricing, Cost of Service.
And is this your first time testifying in front of the Utah Public Service Commission?
It is.
Could you just give the commission a brief summary of your background and how you came to your current position?
Sure. I've been working with the company for about 12 years in the customer service, regulation, and integrated resource planning departments in various roles of increasing responsibility. In March of 2016, I assumed my present position, and in this role, I'm responsible for overseeing the analysis and the work that's entails with supporting the prices and the cost of service analysis for all 6 states that Pacific Corp serves.
And as part of those duties, did you cause to be filed direct rebuttal and surrebuttal testimony in Phase 3 of this proceeding?
I did.
And do you have any corrections or additions to any of those pieces of testimony that you'd like to make at this time?
I do not.
And have you prepared a statement, a summary statement in support of the company's position with respect to time of use rates?
Yes, I have.
Please proceed.
Good morning. First, I'd like to say that I appreciate the time, effort, and thoughtfulness that various parties have put into this effort to develop an electric vehicle time of use pilot. Prior to our Phase 3 filing, 5 workshops were held to discuss the pilot. There have been 2 rounds of testimony and several settlement discussions that have culminated in the stipulation and partial settlement agreement of Phase 3 issues. I think that this partial settlement is just, reasonable, in the public interest, and moves forward many of the issues for the pilot. This partial settlement resolved all issues pertaining to the electric vehicle time of use pilot, except for the rates and the time of use periods. From my review of other parties' surrebuttal testimony, other parties have also expressed their support for the time of use periods that the company proposed. The only remaining issue in dispute among the parties, therefore, is the rates themselves. Western Resource Advocates supports the 2 rate designs that the company proposes. This includes 2 clean time of use options, one with a moderate differential in on to off-peak prices that is about 7 cents a kilowatt hour off-peak and 22 cents a kilowatt hour on-peak, and another with a more pronounced differential that is about 3 cents per kilowatt hour off-peak and 34 cents per kilowatt hour on-peak. The company's proposed rates are easy to understand, would produce results that would provide meaningful information, and would encourage PEV charging outside of the times when the company's peaks occur. The 2 rate options proposed by the company are different enough that strong inferences could be drawn for several variables, and useful information could be gleaned from both the load research study as well as for customers who opt into one of the rates apart from the load research study. The division, the office, and Utah Clean Energy have coalesced around 2 options. One that is the same as the company's rate option 1, and another that is otherwise the same but has inverted tier blocks, such that additional monthly energy consumption is charged at a higher rate. Testing a tiered option compared to a non-tiered option, specifically for the purposes of an electric vehicle time of use pilot, doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. The tiered rate option the office, the division, and Utah Clean Energy propose is not very different from rate option 1. I'm not sure what we would learn, if anything, from testing out these 2 different rate options against one another. While energy charge tiers are being extolled by the other parties as a tool to encourage overall energy reductions, I don't really think that we would be able to parse out the impact that tiers would specifically have on energy reductions from their proposal in this pilot. Time of use participants for this pilot would be individuals who perhaps very recently have adopted electric vehicles and could have a lot of usage associated with that electric vehicle charging. I do not know how reliable any estimates of energy efficiency could actually be for this population of customers. Furthermore, tiered rates may encourage energy efficiency, but they discourage electric vehicle adoption. You cannot both discourage energy usage and encourage additional load from electric vehicles. The 2 goals are diametrically opposed to one another. Tiered rates may encourage energy efficiency, but they do so to the detriment of electric vehicle adoption. Finally, tiers sent a blunt price signal for customers to reduce overall energy usage. On the other hand, time of use prices send a better, more detailed, cost-informed price signal for customers to use energy at the right times. It is more important for customers to use energy at the right times than it is for them to use less overall. Including an option with tiers distracts the company's final analysis for this pilot and also distracts customers from the more critical finding that we are seeking in this pilot, which is what is the pricing incentive or the bill savings that will entice customers to use less during on-peak times. For all of these reasons, I recommend that the Commission approve the company's proposed rate options for the electric vehicle time of use pilot. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Meredith is available for cross-examination by the parties or questions from the commission.
Mr. Jetter?
No questions from the division. Thank you.
Ms. Murray? Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Snar.
Thank you.
I demoted you, Mr. Snar. I'm sorry.
I'm promoted now, but if I don't get it right, Ms. Murray can follow up. Thank you. I have some questions. Directing your attention to your rebuttal testimony at lines 29 through 37, you identify the issues you understand to still be in dispute that the commission should address at this hearing, and you've talked about some of the issues here in your summary. Would you agree with me that the bullet points you set forth at lines 34 through 37 of your testimony are no longer in dispute?
Yes, I would.
Okay. With respect to the issues that do remain in dispute, isn't it true that there are competing proposals on how to design two TOU rates? One where Rocky Mountain proposes to design two different rates, one with a 3-to-1 rate differential and one with a larger rate differential, and a counter-proposal supported by other parties where one rate would include a modest rate differential and the other TOU rate would be based off the same rate differential but would feature tiered or inclining block rates.
That's correct. That's my understanding.
Okay. Let's now address the issues that relate to the tiered or inclining block rates. At lines 105 through 107 of your rebuttal testimony, you state, while tiers have generally been instituted to encourage efficiency for policy reasons, they can be a barrier for customers seeking to buy or lease a PEV. Is that correct?
Yes.
Have you conducted any studies to know that that statement is true?
I have not conducted any specific studies to know whether that statement is true, but I believe that customers do respond to price signals, and having a higher energy rate will, all things equal for some customers, be a barrier.
Do you have any idea as to how many electric vehicle owners there are in the state of Utah service territory?
I don't know exactly right now. My understanding is that it's somewhere between 2,000 to 2,500.
Okay. Isn't it true that most of those customers have some type of charger situated at their home to charge their electric vehicle?
That's correct.
And isn't it true that those customers utilizing a home charger would receive electricity through the Rocky Mountain Power residential rate currently in place?
That's my understanding, yes, they would.
And isn't it also true that the rates that apply to those residential customers are designed with tiers or inclining block rates to encourage conservation?
They are.
Okay. And to discourage the extensive use of electricity?
That's the policy objectives that tiered rates have right now, yes.
So these 2,000 to 2,500 consumers in Utah have somehow found their way to buying a electric vehicle thus far, isn't that right?
They have, but I would note that 2,000 to 2,500 is not a very large number of our customers who have electric vehicles right now. So,
as you understand the proposed pilot rate study, will the study focus on the habits or inclinations of consumers who might be considering the purchase or lease of an electric vehicle?
Our study will specifically look, for the load research study, will specifically examine customers who have an electric vehicle already. However, we will also, through surveys, understand whether any customers, whether the time of use rates or the presence of those time of use rates was something that helped entice those customers to make that decision. Because it is going to be available for up to 1,000 customers to specifically opt into one of the two rate options. And so I think that some customers will specifically see that and realize that there may be cheaper rates available to them if they can charge their electric vehicle during the off-peak period. And knowing that and looking at what their savings might be, that may push them over the edge into making that decision to either purchase or lease an electric vehicle.
Now, does your study program has a process whereby you're going to attempt to identify those people who would participate in the program with an electric vehicle? Is that correct?
So you're saying we'll identify those people who have an electric vehicle presently?
Yes.
Yes, and that is what we will specifically use to target our load research study, where we'll be specifically focused on the behaviors of customers who are on one of the two time of use options or on a control group who are subject to the standard rates that they are right now, and then seeing what naturally would occur with their charging behavior.
So the primary focus of the study is to examine the charging behavior, whether they're on the standard residential rate, whether we're on one of the two time of use rates. Is that right?
I think that's one of the main things that we're going to be looking at, but I think that also the pilot, as it's currently structured, has two components. One component, which is a load research study, specifically, which has higher incentive levels to entice existing electric vehicle customers to be on that study right away, and to be on one of the two rate options, or to not be able to be on one of the two rate options and be on a control group. And then that's going to also have another segment, which is going to be customers who decide to choose one of these two time of use options. And those customers may be existing electric vehicle customers, or maybe prospective ones who specifically those time of use rates played a role in their decision to adopt an electric vehicle.
Has Rocky Mountain considered offering the time of use rates to customers that don't have electric vehicles?
We do offer a time of use option for customers who don't have electric vehicles. Our Schedule 2 is an option that customers who don't have electric vehicles may choose.
In the study you're proposing, you will be comparing the three different groups as part of your pilot study, is that correct?
As part of the load research study, yes. A control group and rate option 1 and rate option 2.
So necessarily there's going to be some comparison made between customers who might be on a rate that would include some tiered or inclining blocks.
Yes.
As well as those that are not.
Yes.
And to include one more rate, a time of use rate that would have a tiered or a block feature would not complicate the study much, because you're already dealing with a tiered rate in the residential program, aren't you?
I think my primary contention with having a tiered rate versus a rate that is not tiered is that, first, as I had mentioned in my summary statement, there's not a whole lot of difference between the tiers that are being proposed. And I think that specifically we're wanting to look at two differentials that are fairly far apart from one another in terms of the price signals that customers would see. And I believe that that will provide more useful information in terms of understanding charging behavior and other variables that I think are useful, such as what role this may play in electric vehicle adoption.
Have you reviewed the testimony, the surrebuttal testimony of Utah Clean Energy's witness, Sarah Wright?
Yes, I have.
And isn't it true that the Utah Clean Energy's rate proposal involving tiers, that Tier 2 would not become applicable until after levels contemplated for average residential usage and anticipated normal electric vehicle charging usage would be fully accommodated?
For the average customer, the way that my understanding is, she's designed this such that a typical customer who uses about 700 kilowatt hours per month and then has additional load of about 300 kilowatt hours a month, which would encompass, I think what I've said may be sort of a typical level of charging for 1,000 miles a month. That would all add up to 1,000 kilowatt hours. However, if a customer had all 1,000 of those kilowatt hours during the off-peak period, those customers would be subject to the tiered rates. I would also note that many customers are not the average. There will be many who are below that average and many who are above that average. And so for those customers who are above the average, those tiers potentially are a little bit more of a barrier for that customer, or a little bit longer of a payback period for that customer in terms of their decision to adopt an electric vehicle.
Now, in your summary just presented earlier today, you said that the usage for electric vehicles should be encouraged and is diametrically opposed to the policies that we have with reference to energy conservation, or words to that effect. Is that correct?
I think what I said was that specifically with this pilot, which is we are making this we've made this application for this pilot, and we're looking to have this electric vehicle pilot to specifically respond to the provision in the STEP Act, which looks to encourage electric vehicle charging during the off-peak period. And so I think that for that, the goals of specifically encouraging energy efficiency and discouraging electric vehicle adoption are diametrically opposed to one another. So I would say that for our existing rates, yes, right now they may encourage energy efficiency, but they do also discourage electric vehicle adoption.
So with respect to the current rates, would I contemplate a proposal from Rocky Mountain that we just take off the existing tiers for residential rates if you happen to have an electric vehicle?
That's not specifically what the company's proposing right now. What we are looking at is a time of use options where customers who opt to be into a time of use rate, where those customers now have the opportunity for much higher bills if their energy occurs more during the on-peak period, would no longer be subject to the tiers because they are now subject to a more cost-based, more detailed pricing, which includes time of use prices.
I guess the real question is, can time of use pricing coexist in a world where we're also trying to encourage energy conservation?
They can coexist, but I think that they undermine some of the goals that are trying to be achieved here, specifically of encouraging electric vehicle charging during the off-peak period.
I have no further questions.
Thank you. Mr. Meekum?
I have no questions, thank you.
Ms. Hayes?
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Meredith.
Morning.
If I could direct you to your surrebuttal testimony at line 100. You say, in this pilot, tiers would distract from the primary message for customers to manage their hourly energy consumption with time of use. I'm so sorry. Pardon me. I'm reading from Mr. Meredith's testimony at line 100 in his surrebuttal. In this pilot, tiers would distract from the primary message for customers to manage their hourly energy consumption with time of use. That's what it says. Is that correct?
Yes.
This is your opinion, correct?
It is my opinion.
This isn't based on a study you've actually conducted already, is it?
No.
All right. Or that others have conducted, studies that others have conducted, correct?
That's correct.
All right. In your statement just now, you said that tiered time of use rates would discourage electric vehicle adoption. Is that correct?
Yes.
It's true, though, isn't it, that one of Utah Clean Energy's explicit objectives in this docket is to encourage electric vehicle adoption, isn't it?
Yes.
All right. And that was one of our primary objectives in designing the tiered time of use rate that we did?
Yes.
All right. Have you reviewed Utah Clean Energy's tiered time of use rate option 2?
Yes, I have.
All right. And if you want a visual, it's at Sarah Wright's rebuttal, page 5.
Get there.
And in your rebuttal, you did some analysis regarding the cost of charging and the simple payback of an electric vehicle at different time of use prices. And I'd like to sort of explore those with you. But looking at this comparison of Rocky Mountain Power's rate option 1 and Utah Clean Energy's rate option 2, it's true, isn't it, that the on-peak Tier 2 price in Utah Clean Energy's rate option 2 is exactly the same as the on-peak tier in Rocky Mountain Power's rate option 1. Is that correct?
And you're referring to the 22.2755 cents is the
Yes.
same between the greater than 200 kilowatt hours consumption in Utah Clean Energy's rate option 2 versus the company's proposed rate option 1
Yes.
for on-peak. Yes,
Yes.
they're the same.
All right. And then with regard to the off-peak prices, Utah Clean Energy's off-peak prices, in the first tier in Utah Clean Energy's option, the Utah Clean Energy's first tier is 6.1 cents, which is a little less than 1 cent below Rocky Mountain Power's 6.8 cents, while our Tier 2 price is less than 1 cent above Rocky Mountain Power's price. And so going to your I'm sorry, what exhibit is it? RMM
It's
2SR?
2SR, yes.
Yes. I don't want to ask you to do any complicated math, but if it takes 347 kilowatt hours a month to charge an electric vehicle, and it's less than 1 cent more per kilowatt hour to charge entirely in the second tier under Utah Clean Energy's option, that's around $4 more a month, right?
I haven't done the math, but I would say that relative to what Utah Clean Energy was looking at in the rebuttal testimony, where the differential was 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour, now moving forward to the rebuttal testimony, which has a differential during the off-peak period of about 1.6 cents a kilowatt hour, I would say that the 1.6 cents a kilowatt hour is better in terms of not discouraging electric vehicle adoption as much. I would also say, though, that looking at specifically the difference in the rebuttal rates, these rates are less discouraging to electric vehicle adoptions. I would also say that they are so similar to rate option 1 that it's going to be very challenging to understand very much from these rates. And I don't think they're very different from one another to where we could really draw any very strong inferences from the 1.6 cents for this specific population.
But you don't know that, having not actually undergone the load research study.
No, but I know that looking at these rates and seeing how close they are to one another, and just thinking myself about in a few years from now having to write a report and look at how that may have influenced specifically energy reductions, which I think is what Utah Clean Energy is wanting to understand, is how tiered rates may influence conservation. I think it's going to be very challenging to be able to tell that there's one rate option which is 6.8 cents a kilowatt hour about, and another rate option that's 6.1 versus 7.7 cents a kilowatt hour during the off-peak period, whether it's below 800 or above 800 kilowatt hours. I haven't done any specific analysis, but looking at these rates, I think it's going to be very challenging to try to parse out any sort of meaningful information from those.
But you've also said that tiers will distract from the time of use price signals. And so it's a little confusing which argument you're trying to make. I mean, are the tiers going to distract from the price signals, or are they going to give you the same results?
So I think maybe, if I may, what you're trying to say is, will they distract the company's analysis, or will they distract the customers themselves in terms of deciding to consume more or less energy during the on and off peak periods and respond to the price signals? Is that maybe what you're trying to understand?
What I'm trying to understand is, or what it sounds like we don't know what the impact will be. It sounds like you're making a lot of conclusions without any evidence.
I think looking at these specific rates and how close they are, I think that it's very likely that it will be really hard to say that a customer has really reduced their energy consumption specifically for electric vehicle owners, because I think this is a very unique population that we're dealing with. I think it's going to be very challenging to be able to say whether they have reduced overall energy consumption or not. And I think that there are, a couple of competing goals here with the rates that you're looking at. I think that on the one hand, and I understand this with designing rates, that on the one hand you want to have results that are meaningful enough that you can really see, two different points and be able to draw some clear inferences where the two rates are enough different from one another to be able to draw clear conclusions. And on the other hand, I can appreciate that Utah Clean Energy also does not want to discourage electric vehicle adoption. I believe that they share that goal with the company and with other parties in this case. However, I think that these rates, as they are so similar that I think that they are not as much of a barrier as what I had previously described in terms of 1.6 cents compared to the 2.5 cents. They are still somewhat of a barrier, I would say, and I think they are still very close to where it's going to be very hard to understand any sort of impact from energy efficiency, specifically for this population of customers.
But as you said before, we have not actually studied this in Utah, the impact of tier rates with time of use rates, correct?
We haven't specifically studied it, but a visual examination, and I think somebody who looks at Table 1 from Utah Clean Energy's surrebuttal will see that these rates are so close, and specifically looking at this population of electric vehicle customers, it's going to be very hard to tell whether there was additional energy efficiency. I think also what will skew the results is that there's going to be a natural inclination, I think, for smaller users to want to select the tiered option naturally, and for larger users to want to select the non-tiered option. And then I don't know what that will actually tell us about these customers, even specifically for the customers who opt into it. I think the load research study will also be challenging to understand whether there's any behavioral changes because the rates are so close to one another.
There is also a random assignment group, correct?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about, the two different groups, one that's selecting it, one that's being randomly assigned, correct.
No further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Hayes. Ms. Gardner?
We have no questions at this time.
Thank you. I have just a couple. Mr. Meredith, leaving aside the tiered rate issue, I believe there was a suggestion in some of the written testimony that with respect to option 2, something in the way of a compromise of a ratio of less than 10-to-1 might be an acceptable solution, something maybe in the nature of 5-to-1 or 6-to-1 for peak to off-peak pricing. Would you consider endorsing something less than 10-to-1 for option 2?
I think that having something less than 10-to-1 that was not tiered would be better than comparing a tiered versus a not tiered option that are very close to one another. My preference would be the 10-to-1, but I think 6-to-1 or a 7-to-1 would also give us useful information. I think that having those points sort of far apart from one another, but still providing fairly robust savings in both options relative to what a customer can achieve with our present rates, including our present time of use Schedule 2. I think having those 2 points far apart from each other will allow us to be able to draw lines between those and be able to clearly tell between different variables what the impacts may be.
Thank you. The other parties can speak for themselves, but just for my clarification, I thought I heard you say that with respect to the time period that would be used for the peak and off-peak period, there was no longer disagreement between the parties. Did I hear you correctly?
That's my understanding from reading the SIR rebuttal testimonies of the different parties.
Okay, well, we'll let them speak, but I wanted to make sure I understood you. Finally, to the extent the commission were inclined to adopt something like a 10-to-1 or a larger ratio for option 2, are there any measures that the company or specifically you would suggest that might be taken to put customers on adequate notice that that might not be an option that would survive the pilot program?
Absolutely. I think we need to be very straightforward with our customers and educate them well that this is a pilot. These aren't necessarily rates that will continue forever or even beyond this pilot period. We are looking to gather information and understand the impacts, and then after that point, they may be continued in another form or may not be continued.
Do you have any specific recommendations, such as language to the tariff? I realize that I'm just dropping this on you right now, but do you think perhaps further notifications in the tariff or some other process to notify customers would be appropriate?
I think the tariff itself spells out that it's for the pilot period and discusses when it will end. Find the tariff here. But it does say that it will end at the end of the step pilot period. So I think that having that, and then specifically having that addressed in the customer communications that we send to customers will be important, that they realize that this is a program.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Solander, any redirect?
Thank you. No redirect.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Meredith.
Thank you.
Mr. Solander, do you have any other witnesses?
I do not. That concludes the company's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Jetter.
Thank you. The division would like to recall Mr. Robert A. Davis, and I'm actually not sure if I think he hasn't been excused, so he'd still be sworn in. But
Mr. Davis, you're still under oath. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Davis. Earlier in this hearing, you've provided your name and occupation for the record, so I'm not going to ask you that again, but I'd like to go through briefly the testimony that you filed in this docket. Is it correct that you have caused to be filed in this docket direct, rebuttal, and surrebuttal? And because of the complexity and multiple phases of this docket, I'd like to identify them a little more specifically as DPU Exhibit P3 1.0 direct, DPU Exhibit number P3 1.0 rebuttal, and DPU Exhibit number P3 1.0 surrebuttal.
That's correct.
And do you have any corrections or changes you'd like to make to that testimony?
I do not.
If you were asked the same questions that are asked in your pre-filed testimony that I've just identified today, would your answers remain the same?
They would.
Thank you. I'd like to move to enter into the evidence of this hearing the direct rebuttal and surrebuttal that I've identified previously.
They're admitted.
Thank you. Have you prepared a brief statement summarizing the position of the division?
I have.
Please go ahead.
The division has reviewed the company's application for implementation of the electric vehicle incentive and time of use pricing programs as outlined in the Commission's Phase 3 scheduling order in this docket. In my direct testimony, I expressed the division's concerns surrounding the company's proposed time of use option 2 as being similar to its proposed option 1, but only more aggressive. The division expressed its concerns about the possible punitive pricing structure of the company's proposed option 2 based on the customer's ability to shift load, other than charging their electric vehicles to off-peak periods. Additionally, the division had concerns that the proposed price guarantee may distort usage behavior. In my rebuttal testimony, I expressed the division's concerns surrounding the proposed rate designs and varying time periods proposed by the Office of Consumer Services, Similarly, I expressed the division's concerns surrounding the proposal of Utah Clean Energy's rate designs using tiered rates and blocking around 1,000 kilowatt hours, along with varying time periods and super off-peak pricing. In Sir rebuttal, I stated that designing rates requires balancing several, often opposing objectives or principles while trying to address all the parties' expectations for a program such as the Electric Vehicle Incentive Program. Prior to filing testimony, the parties, including the division, discussed several potential rate designs and time periods for the pilot. The division has not previously offered its own rate designs because its rate designs were not significantly different than the other parties. However, in my Sir rebuttal, I offered the division's support for the company's proposed option 1, or one of the options proposed by the Office of Consumer Services for one of the pilot options. For the pilot's option 2, the division offered support for Utah Clean Energy's tiered rate proposal with a different blocking structure, providing the billing comparison sent a strong enough signal to the customer to charge their electric vehicles off-peak. The division's underlying expectation for the electric vehicle pilot has been to find 2 rate designs that are cost-based and potentially could be used or adapted going forward after the pilot ends. One of the key points to that end is an attempt to better understand electric vehicle customer behavior and determine what will incent those customers to charge their electric vehicles off-peak and encourage them to use energy more efficiently. Therefore, the division supports the company's proposed time of use option 1 with the 2-part on-peak, off-peak pricing structure and 3-to-1 ratio as option 1 for the pilot. The division further supports the company's proposed time periods of 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. for the summer and winter months with an additional 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. window during the winter months, excluding weekends and holidays for both proposed time of use rate options. Since rebuttal testimony, the parties had several discussions regarding a time of use option 2 proposal that would optimally support the pilot. The expectation of the time of use rate to incent customers to charge their electric vehicles off-peak also needs to consider bill impacts that may occur as a result of the proposed rates combined with the customer's other energy use behaviors. From these discussions and in consideration of the parties' expectations and the company's proposed option 2, the division supports Utah Clean Energy's revised 4-part tiered rate design around 200 kilowatt on-peak and 800 kilowatt off-peak as an overall compromise. Utah Clean Energy's design offers a similar 3-to-1 on-peak off-peak pricing structure as the company's proposed option 1, while incenting customers to use energy more efficiently through the design's tiered blocks. In consideration of the settlement between the parties for all other issues, the division supports the company's proposed time of use option 1, the company's proposed time of use periods, and Utah Clean Energy's proposed rate design for option 2 as discussed above. The division finds the electric vehicle incentive and time of use pricing program as outlined in the Commission's Phase 3 scheduling order in this docket to be in the public interest and recommends approval. The division recommends this approval be conditional upon the accounting treatment, reporting requirements, and treatment of OMAG expenses as in the prior phases of this docket. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have no further questions. Mr. Davis is available for cross-examination.
Mr. Solander?
No question.
Mr. Snar?
No questions.
Mr. Meekum? Ms. Hayes?
No questions, thank you.
Ms. Gardner?
No questions.
So, Mr. Davis, just to summarize your testimony so that I'm clear, essentially the division is endorsing the company's option 1 rate, the company's proposed time period with respect to peak and off-peak, and supports UCE's revised proposal with respect to option 2 rates, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. How would you respond to Mr. Meredith's concern that the similarity between UCE's proposed option 2 rates and the option 1 rates will undermine the desired outcome of the pilot period? In other words, what the company hopes to learn from conducting the study?
I think Mr. Meredith has valid points. I think in to compromise, there's also some benefits in studying the tiered rates. The division felt, as I mentioned in my direct testimony, that the 10-to-1 option was a little bit punitive. And in the case that customers could not shift some of their other load to off-peak, in consideration of the price guarantee, my understanding is that is after the year study, so during the month there's going to be possibly high bills that would take place. So that was part of our consideration in supporting Utah Clean Energy's option.
Thank you. And with respect to any proposal to, setting aside again the tiered rate structure, with respect to option 2, with respect to any proposal to adopt something less aggressive than a 10-to-1 ratio, something between 5-to-1 to 7-to-1, would the division find that more acceptable than a 10-to-1 ratio?
Yes.
Okay. I don't have anything further. Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Thank you.
Mr. Snar.
Yes, we'd be happy to call Cheryl Murray as our witness.
Ms. Murray, you're still under oath.
Thank you.
Ms. Murray, you previously provided your name and business address and described the testimony that was submitted as part of this Phase 3 hearing. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you have you prepared a summary of your testimony as it relates to the issues that are remaining to be resolved in this hearing?
Yes, I have.
Would you present that summary at this time?
Yes. The settlement stipulation resolved the majority of issues except for the energy prices to be used in TOU rate option 1 and 2, as well as the hours to be included in the definition of on and off peak. However, in reviewing the surrebuttal testimony filed by all parties, it is clear that the differences have been narrowed even further. For purposes of the pilot study, it appears that all parties now support the company's definition of on and off peak time periods. It also appears that all parties support including the company's TOU rate option 1. As stated by Mr. Meredith, the only remaining difference is the specific design of rate option 2 to study in comparison to existing residential rate schedule 1 and the company's proposed TOU rate option 1. As stated in our surrebuttal testimony, the office recommends that the commission order a TOU pilot that uses the company's definition of on and off peak periods, the company's proposal for rate option 1, and a TOU rate option 2 with tiers for both on-peak and off-peak rates. The office believes the following principles comprise the primary objectives for the rate option 2 design. Maintain approximately the same differential between on and off-peak rates for both rate option 1 and rate option 2, so that the primary difference between the two rate designs to be studied is whether and how having tiered rates impacts changes in consumption. Establish a meaningful difference between Tier 1 and Tier 2 for both TOU time periods, while assuring the company's revenue requirement would still be collected. Design an appropriate break between Tier 1 and Tier 2 to create a meaningful rate design differential. Tiers should be developed in the context of the residential average monthly consumption of 700 kilowatt hours, with an understanding of how the additional consumption associated with electric vehicle charging will impact total consumption. The office has reviewed the specific proposal presented by UCE, Utah Clean Energy, in surrebuttal testimony, and finds it meets the criteria we articulated and supports it as a reasonable design for TOU rate option 2. In our surrebuttal testimony, the office recommended that the commission order a short compliance phase in this proceeding, which would require the company to submit specific rates that would comply with the concept the commission determines are in the public interest. If the Commission accepts Utah Clean Energy's proposal, the office continues to recommend that the Commission order a compliance filing by the company so that all parties have an opportunity to review the proposal and the rates and bill impacts can be verified. The Commission should also allow comments and reply comments on such a compliance filing so that the Commission can ensure that the rates meet the Commission's objectives.
Does that conclude your summary?
It does.
We would tender Ms. Murray for cross-examination.
Mr. Solander? Mr. Jetter? Mr. Meekum?
Questions, thank you.
Ms. Hayes?
No questions, thank you.
Ms. Gardner?
No questions.
Ms. Murray, just so I'm clear, essentially, then you concur with the division and all of the recommendations as to what the commission should do with respect to the proposal, right?
Regarding the rates, yes.
Regarding the rates. So specifically, on board with the company's proposed on and off peak time periods, support the company's option 1, and support UCE's proposal with respect to option 2.
That's correct.
Okay. And do you have anything you would like to add with respect to Mr. Meredith's concern that having the option 2 rates be so similar to the option 1 rates will undermine the efficacy of the study?
Well, we think it is reasonable to have those two options available. I would note and I know Mr. Meredith has said that he's not sure that we will be able to observe what effect it has on conservation. But in the Rocky Mountain Institute report, it does comment that there isn't much study on how conservation is affected by time of use rates. And so we think that tiers within it would have give us an opportunity to look at those things. And we also believe that a compliance filing at some point can be used to tweak rates if we feel that that's necessary.
And Mr. Davis expressed some concern that customers who elect option 2 under the company's proposal might experience some sticker shock when their bill arrives that won't be remedied until the end of the year. Does the office care to comment with respect to that observation?
Well,
Ready? Go ahead, Ms. Murray.
okay. I guess I would have two observations regarding that. First, in the available to select group, so people who are self-selecting an option, they do have one opportunity during the year under the company's proposal, if it were accepted. They have an opportunity one time to move to a different rate. And under the randomly assigned group or the load research study, there is the 110% guarantee. So they're over the course of a year, their total rate would not be higher than 10% of what it would be under residential Schedule 1. However, month by month, they would see that sticker shock.
All right, I have nothing else. Thank you, Ms. Murray. Mr. Meekum, do you have testimony to present during this phase of the Phase 3 hearing?
I do not, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Hayes?
Thank you. Utah Clean Energy will call Ms. Wright, but I'm wondering if we could take a 5-minute recess so I could refill my water and
Two things. Mr. Snar, I didn't ask if you had another witness. I assumed you didn't, but if you do, I should allow you the opportunity to call him or her.
We have no other witnesses other than the ones we've identified, and with respect to Mr. Thomas, who only addressed the stipulation, I think we've excused him, and we have nothing more.
Okay, thank you. And does anyone object to taking a 5-minute break? Okay, we'll be in recess until 10:30. Thanks.
Thank you.
So I told James Ellis that
We're back on the record. Ms. Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Hammer. Utah Clean Energy will now call Ms. Sarah Wright. And she will need to be sworn.
Ms. Wright, do you swear to tell the truth? I do. Thank you.
Ms. Wright, please state your name and title for the record.
My name is Sarah Wright. I'm the Executive Director of Utah Clean Energy.
In Phase 3 of this docket, did you file direct testimony along with one exhibit on April 6, 2017?
Yes, I did.
And did you file rebuttal testimony on April 27th, 2017?
Yes.
And did you file surrebuttal testimony on May 16th, 2017?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any corrections to make to any of your testimony?
Yes, I do.
Go ahead.
The first correction that I would like to make is to my rebuttal testimony. It is mislabeled as direct testimony on the cover page and on the page headers. These should be corrected to read rebuttal rather than direct. Likewise, turning to my surrebuttal testimony is labeled rebuttal testimony in the docket number block. Finally, please turn to page 7 of my surrebuttal testimony. At line 110, the number 4 should be replaced by 3.7. The sentence should read, "The differential between the second on-peak tier and the first off-peak tier is 3.7 to 1.
Do you have any other corrections to make?
No.
So if I asked you the same questions today as set forth in your testimony, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Mr. Meredith provided an exhibit with his surrebuttal testimony that provided a table of parties' positions. Given that positions have been clarified through the course of this docket, do you have any edits to make to that table with regard to Utah Clean Energy's positions?
Yes.
With regard to the first issue, whether one of the time of use rates should include tiers, is Mr. Meredith's summary correct?
Yes, Utah Clean Energy recommends that one of the rate options should include inclining block tiers.
With regard to the second issue, that is, what should the differential be between on and off-peak energy prices? What is Utah Clean Energy's position?
Utah Clean Energy recommends that the commission adopt the company's first option, which has a differential of 3 to 1, and UCE's tiered option, which is roughly a 3 to 1 differential. Between tiers. And the differential between on-peak second tier and the off-peak first tier is 3.7 to 1.
And then with regard to the third issue in Mr. Meredith's table regarding the on-peak and off-peak time periods, what is Utah Clean Energy's position?
Well, we still have questions about the cost basis of these time periods. For the purposes of this pilot, we accept the time periods proposed by the company.
And then with regard to the final issue in the table regarding the super off-peak period, what is Utah Clean Energy's position?
Mr. Meredith is correct. Utah Clean Energy has decided not to advocate for a super off-peak period at this time.
Having provided these clarifications, do you have a summary of your testimony to present to the commission?
Yes.
Please proceed.
Well, first off, I would like to thank the commission and all parties for investigating and working on the time of use rate design pilot. Utah Clean Energy strongly supports a transition to electric vehicles. However, as the penetrations of electric vehicles increases, it will be critical to both continue to accelerate more efficient use of electricity and encourage customers to charge their vehicles during off-peak times. These two parameters, being as efficient as possible and shifting consumption to off-peak, will put downward pressure on rates over the long term for the benefit of all ratepayers. Throughout this docket, we worked with parties to find as much common ground as possible. And through review of parties' filed testimony, Utah Clean Energy was persuaded that it would be useful in the pilot to study two similar time of use rates, one with inclining block rates and one without. Because electric vehicle adoption has the potential to increase load overall, it is important to consider the signals for efficiency embedded in time of use rates. Thus, evaluating a tiered rate time of use option will help us evaluate the impact of the combination of time of use and inclining block rates on both conservation and shifting usage to off-peak times relative to a non-time of use rate option. Utah Clean Energy worked in consultation with the Office of Consumer Services and the Division of Public Utilities to develop a tiered rate option to align closely with Rocky Mountain Power's Rate Option 1. Using the company's worksheets, we designed this rate option with the following objectives. Maintain approximately the same differential between on and off peak as was used in Rocky Mountain Power's Rate Option 1. Provide a meaningful differential between Tier 1 and 2 to send signals to conserve. And also to provide savings for EV owners, and to reduce the disparity of bill impacts across residential energy usage levels that exist in Rocky Mountain Power's Rate Option 1 and their Rate Option 2. Some parties had concerns about the complexity of layering time of use rates and inclining block rates. However, Utah ratepayers have had inclining block rate pricing for over 15 years, and our proposal merely layers time of use pricing onto tiered pricing that customers are already well accustomed to and familiar with. Some parties had concern that a 3-to-1 differential between on and off peak pricing would not be sufficient to send signals to shift load to off peak. It's important to note that these rates are not designed to tell people not to cook at a certain time during peak. Electric vehicles are technology enabled. That means they can be programmed to charge during off-peak periods. If a customer knows that they'll pay 3 to 4 times more to fuel their vehicle when they get home from work, they will set their car to start charging in the off-peak period. It's not that they have to go out and tell it to do it right at that time, they just have to program it and the car will just do that. Parties also expressed concern that tiered rates would discourage EV adoption. But my analysis shows that it will still cost less than $30 per month for an EV customer to charge their vehicle under UCE's proposal. Even charging at the second tier off-peak rate, even if the charging is all done at the second off-peak rate. Further, if there is a desire to tweak the tiers such that there is a larger differential, if we keep the second tier below the current first tier of 8.8 cents, customers will definitely save as compared to their current rates. Option 2 treats all usage levels of customers equitably and still provides significant savings opportunities for electric vehicle owners who charge off-peak. And with regard to the company's proposed rate option 2, we are very concerned about the extreme 10-to-1 differential or even a 5 to 6-to-1 differential between the off and on-peak prices because of the price signals that this very low rate sends. During all off-peak hours of the day, including weekends and holidays, electricity would be billed at an extremely low rate. In the case of the 10-to-1 differential, it would be 3.4 cents. These off-peak hours constitute 85% of the summer hours and 80% of the winter hours. This extremely cheap electricity could lead to inefficient and wasteful use of electricity that in the long run could lead to costly system investments and rate increases that could have been avoided. In summary, Utah Clean Energy recommends that the Commission reject the company's Rate Option 2 and replace it with Utah Clean Energy's Tiered Rate Option 2. as the two time-of-use rate options to implement and study during this time-of-use pilot program. We further recommend that the Commission order a compliance phase of this proceeding in order for the company to verify that rates and bill impacts for rate option 2. Finally, electric vehicles and conservation can coexist. That is what we are trying to test in this pilot. If parties feel that the rate options in our two tiers are too similar, we could easily tweak those tiers in a compliance filing. What we are trying to avoid in our proposal, in the compliance filing that we recommended, what we are trying to avoid in our proposal is ratepayer impact, both by encouraging electric vehicle owners to shift charging to off-peak periods and also reducing load overall, both of which put downward pressure on rates. Thank you. That concludes my testimony.
Thank you. Utah Clean Energy will first move the admission of the direct rebuttal and surrebuttal of testimony of Sarah Wright, and including the exhibit that accompanied the direct testimony of Sarah Wright, and then make her available for cross-examination.
They're admitted.
Thank you.
Mr. Solander?
Thank you. Could you turn to page 9 of your surrebuttal testimony?
Yes. I'm there.
Thank you. On line 37, you're referencing the off-peak
Wait,
rate
I
of-
must be, I
One-
probably have bad labels. On 9 of my surrebuttal?
Yes, starting at line 137.
Okay, I thought you used a different line number.
You're referencing the off-peak rate of 3.4 cents, and you say, such a low rate for the majority of hours could lead to customer decisions to invest in more electricity-consuming devices and use more electricity at economically inefficient and unsustainable levels. Is that right?
Yes, that's true.
Does the electricity a consumer uses in a month after the 800 kilowatt hour cost the company more to produce?
When we implemented tiered rates back in 2001, we looked at a number of factors, including the marginal cost of new resources. So if new resources are added, then it does impact rates.
That's not what I asked. I said, does the electricity a consumer uses in a 1 month period after an arbitrary amount cost the company more to produce?
In the short term, I can't speak to that. It depends on if you have to go to the market and what's happening with the market at that time.
But in fact, if the electricity is used off-peak, it would cost the company significantly less to produce, would it not?
It would cost them less than yes.
Yeah. And that's regardless of how much the customer has already used that month.
In the short term, if markets have availability.
Okay, but isn't it true then that if the off-peak use prices are covering the variable cost of energy as the company proposes, right?
According to your worksheets, I can't speak to that.
And would you agree, though, that off-peak consumption is not contributing to the need for investment in new generation?
Well, think back to our electric home rate that we had years ago. In the long run, you encourage people to build electric homes and offered them cheaper rates, and then we had to raise those rates. So you have to think of short-term and long-term.
But isn't it true that if we're covering the variable cost of energy and off-peak consumption is not contributing to the need for investment in new generation, then by definition, that off-peak usage is not economically inefficient?
So you can't say that if we build off-peak load that you won't have to make new investments going forward. And that's what we're trying to balance, long-term and short-term costs.
Your proposal isn't based on cost-based rate-making principles, though, is it?
We used your worksheet and to develop cost to meet your cost of service. maybe what you're saying is that your current rates based aren't, we used your worksheet to develop this proposal.
Do tiered pricing have any basis in cost-based rate making?
Well, the idea is that you consider tiered rates, you consider the marginal cost of new investments, and you balance that over time. I remember I was on the stand in one case where it was, if everyone used the lower amount of energy, costs would be cheaper over the long run because you wouldn't have to build new investments.
So is that the same as a no?
No, it isn't. Ask me again and I'll try to answer more clearly.
Your pricing proposal with the tiered rates is not based on cost-based rate-making principles, is it?
I used your spreadsheet and balanced the cost through the tiers. So then are your current rates not based on cost-based principles?
You want me to put Mr. Meredith back on the stand?
I mean, I'm using I can't answer that question.
Okay.
I used your spreadsheets
Okay.
to calculate these rates.
Let me ask
and
it
made
differently then.
So that you calculated your cost, you collected your cost of service.
Wouldn't it be useful if, using the time of use rates proposed by the company, wouldn't it be useful to determine if usage was increased during the off-peak period in order to determine if it is economically inefficient?
Please ask that again.
Wouldn't it be useful to test whether the time of use rates proposed by the company would result in higher usage during the off-peak period in order to determine if that usage is economically inefficient?
I can't answer that question.
So in your testimony, and I think in your summary, you also stated that we're only layering the pricing onto the tiered rates that the customers are already well accustomed to and familiar with. Is that a fair summary?
I said onto tiered rates, not the exact tiered rates, but yes, onto tiered rates.
Have you done any studies on how well customers are, quote, accustomed to and familiar with tier pricing?
I'm not sure how much you could speak to that, but I know customers that understand that the more you use, the more you pay.
Have you presented any evidence that the average customer is aware how tiered pricing affects their bill?
No, I have not.
Do you believe that any decrease in rates is not in the public interest?
No, I propose a decrease in rates.
If costs decrease or are lower in certain periods, do you agree that those savings should be passed on to customers?
If you file a rate case, if we are saving money, then they would be passed on to customers.
On page 12 of your testimony, you state that EV owners...
Sir Rebuttal?
I'm sorry, yes, Sir Rebuttal. Line 182.
Okay.
EV owners will save money on a TOU tiered rate if they charge off-peak?
Yes.
And is that comparing the savings to a gas vehicle?
To a gas vehicle or to your current rates?
But they would not save as much when compared to the company's proposed rates, is that correct?
I don't know, it's a difference of $4. Electric vehicle owners already know that they save money with electricity as compared to gas. So yes, there's a difference of $4.
Thank you. That concludes my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Solander. Mr. Jetter, anything?
I have no questions. Thank you.
Mr. Snar?
I have no questions.
Mr. Meekum? Ms. Gardner?
Yes, we do have a few questions for Ms. Wright.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Ms. Wright, do you agree that adding tiered rates to a time of use rate design for this pilot has the effect of confusing customers?
I agree that it adds a new communication element that will be necessary, yes.
And I believe you've said in your testimony and today that customers are used to tiered rates. Is that correct?
Yes, we've had them since about 2001.
Is it fair to say that electric vehicle customers are not used to tiered rates plus time of use rates?
Yes.
Okay. And the idea of a time of use rate for purposes of this pilot, as we've heard from the company, is to incent charging during off-peak hours, correct?
Yes, and if you're paying 3 or more times more, I think that would, regardless if you have tiers, encourage people to charge off-peak.
But the idea of the time of use rate pilot is to encourage this off-peak charging.
Well, when you do rate design, you're always balancing different objectives. You know, you can look to Von Bright's principles. One of them is conservation. So we looked at trying to balance all the principles for rate design, including conservation. And we think that it will encourage people to charge off-peak, and it will be able to study not just the impacts of the tiered rate, but also communication. How do you communicate that?
Okay. So let me try this another way. Would you agree that one of the stated purposes of using a time of use rate for this pilot is to encourage EV owners to charge during off-peak periods?
Yes, I stated that.
Okay. And because they pay less to use energy, and the reason why they're charging during these off-peak periods is because they're actually charged less to do so during those times, correct?
Or dramatically more if they don't, yes.
But if they're charging off-peak, they are paying less, in fact, than if they were to charge on-peak, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And this, in turn, as we've heard from the company, helps the company avoid or delay costly investments in infrastructure over time, correct?
Yes, both conservation and shifting peak avoid investments.
But what we've heard from the company today specifically is that a time of use rate can help them avoid these costly investments by shifting use to off-peak times, correct?
Yes, I would agree.
Okay.
That's one principle.
Okay. And the idea of a tiered rate, as you've stated today on the stand, is that you actually pay more for the energy you use, correct?
Yes.
Okay. But under your proposal, even if an EV owner is following the time of use guidelines as laid out by the company, they will in fact pay more if they hit your top tier, correct?
Yes, but they'll pay less than they currently pay under the current rates.
And when you say than what they currently pay, are you referring to the current tiered rates that we have in place today for residential customers?
Yes, and they'll even pay less than the first tier of our current rates.
Okay, but under your proposed combination rate, sort of like a hybrid rate, right, where we have a time of use plus this tiered rate, if an EV owner is following sort of the guidelines of the time of use pilot and they're actually charging off peak when energy is cheaper, if they hit your top tier, they will pay more.
Yeah, they'll pay maybe $4 more.
Would you agree that that could possibly create a disincentive for certain EV owners to be charging?
No, I definitely would disagree. I mean, they're saving significantly from a gasoline vehicle, and I don't think that $4 a month, if you're saving $50 on gasoline, would discourage people from an electric vehicle. No.
Do you feel at a minimum, though, it could create confusing messages to an EV owner?
No, I mean, it's pretty simple.
Could you
pay
explain?
more when you charge on peak, and you save more the more you can serve in all hours.
Okay. However, I guess I'm still having a hard time understanding how this creates a very clear incentive to an EV owner who is vigilant about charging their car during off-peak hours and is wanting to save money. Because if they are, in fact, using a lot of energy under your tiered rate, it doesn't really matter whether they're charging off-peak, correct? They'll still be dinged for that?
I don't call that a ding. I call that smart rate making.
But do you agree that they'll pay more?
I've told you like 6 times, they'll pay $4 more.
Ms. Wright, I'm just trying to clarify your testimony. I appreciate your patience, but this is all a part of getting the answers correct for our record,
good.
okay?
I'm glad.
I think with that, I think I've clarified my questions and answers with Ms. Wright. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gardner. Anything else, Ms. Hayes? Yes?
I have no questions for this witness, Your Honor, and expect to have few, if any, throughout the hearing, but I didn't want to seize this moment to make known that I'm present on the line and listening in from the outset of today's hearing. So thank you for your indulgence and letting me
No, you're certainly welcome to be here, Mr. Halsell. So you wish to officially enter an appearance then? Mr. Halsell?
do I wish to enter an appearance?
Yes.
Yes, I do. So also on behalf of the Sierra Club, located at 1536 Coop Street, Suite 312, Denver, Colorado, 80202.
Can you please spell your name?
Yes, the first name is Joe, J-O-E, last name is Halso, H-A-L-S-O.
And Mr. Halso, we're nearing the conclusion, I think, of the presentation of testimony today, and you haven't had an opportunity to examine any witnesses. I imagine there would be some rather vigorous objection if we rehash material, but we should discuss it if there's a desire. Are you comfortable with us proceeding from this point forward without recalling any witnesses?
Yes, I am, Your Honor. I've been listening in since the outset and just had found an opportunity to jump in. And maybe the only thing I would offer is should you wish, I would be happy to make a statement on behalf of Sierra Club with respect to the stipulation and partial settlement, if we could join. Although I know that window has passed, but otherwise I do not expect that questions for witnesses, not at witnesses to offer today.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Halso. Ms. Hayes, I'm sorry, did you say there was nothing else?
Just a momentary redirect, if
Go
that's
ahead.
all right. Ms. Wright, you mentioned at one point about balancing objectives in rate design, and Mr. Solander asked some questions about energy costs. Is cost causation the only rate-making principle?
No, it is one of the rate-making principles that you need to balance.
No further questions.
Thank you. Ms. Wright, I just have a couple. So just to clarify, if I understand your testimony today, is it a fair summary that that UCE's primary concern with respect to the company's proposed option 2 is that it could create a situation where some customers could enjoy a windfall?
I would say our primary concern, and if you remember our direct testimony, is that we want to test tiered rates, and so that's very important. And I think with the tiered rate option 2, for customers that can move their energy use off-peak, I don't know if it's a windfall, but they may make investments that are not prudent. And I don't know if you were here, but back in 2001 or before then, when we had incentives for electric homes, people made investments based on a rate structure that was not tenable for the long term. And so we want to make sure that we're sending signals to make smart decisions, not only today, but for the long term. And that's why we think the conservation principle needs to be balanced with the incentive, with rates that also incent electric vehicles and charging off-peak.
Does the status of this proposal as a pilot program that will presumably be limited in duration alleviate your concerns at all?
Well, that's why we think we should be testing a tiered rate, because it is a pilot program. How do you message it? What do you need to do? Can we see savings? That's why it makes sense. And some of the studies, and Ms. Murray mentioned it, is that the Rocky Mountain Institute report suggests that we need to study conservation signals in time of use rate pricing.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Wright. I have nothing else.
Thank you.
Ms. Hayes, no other witnesses?
No other witnesses. Thank you.
Ms. Gardner?
WRA calls Mr. Kenneth L. Wilson to the stand.
Mr. Wilson, you're still under oath?
Mr. Wilson, excuse me, have you prepared a brief summary of your testimony today?
Yes. Yes.
Will you please go ahead and provide that summary to this commission?
Yes, thank you. So, electric vehicles are coming. They are being slowly adopted now, but we believe that this will increase over time, and we encourage that. We think that's a very good idea for many, many reasons that I won't go into. But as an engineer, I'm concerned about the impact that will have on the utility, their generation fleet, their distribution, their transmission. And that's why we really want to encourage smart charging of these vehicles at off-peak hours. And this pilot is an excellent way to see how customers will change their charging behavior based on time of use rates. And so we are very encouraged that this pilot is going to be conducted, and our sole objective is to make sure that the pilot comes up with results that are statistically significant and can be used in future rate cases to inform the commission about how they might want to design rates for everybody in the future. And with that in mind, I had some more preamble that I was going to do, but I don't think I need to do that. I think I'll focus on kind of the issue that we're trying to grapple with here, which is whether to go with what I would call a clean time of use for option 1 and option 2 as proposed by Rocky Mountain Power, or whether to layer in a tiered rate structure onto one of those options. And I guess what I would like to say primarily about that, and I think Mr. Meredith in his summary gave a pretty good explanation of his concern, but I wanted to say that I have been involved in similar studies for almost 40 years. I was at Bell Labs for 18 years and principally in the network performance group. And we actually did a lot of studies that looked at how customers reacted to various issues in the telecommunications network. And while that's not exactly the same as energy, the statistical properties of a study are very similar. And I had PhD statisticians working for me, helping to design studies of various types. So my concern is that we come up with a very statistically valid study. And this type of study, to the best of my knowledge, has not been done in any other state. So we really have a golden opportunity not only to show something to the whole nation, but also specifically to see what happens in Utah when electric vehicle owners have the opportunity to use different rates. And what we want is really to get some results that we can make very valid conclusions against. And you heard Mr. Meredith express his concerns. I was pointed to one section of my SIR rebuttal by the division. In that SIR rebuttal, I presented a graph that was in a Rocky Mountain Institute study. And there are several things that we can kind of see in that. And based on that graph, I said, well, maybe to address some concerns, we could lower the 10-to-1 ratio a little bit and still get significant results. And I still think that's true. Either 7-to-1 or 6-to-1 would probably be a good place to end up, though the 10-to-1 certainly will get us 2 points. The real issue here is that we need 2 points so we can make some conclusions about if you drew a line between those points, what would it look like on a similar graph to the one that I presented. And my concern is that if we only have one clean time of use point to put on a graph, it's kind of out in space. We need a second point that is the same except for the ratio in order to really see what's happening when we move from what I call a moderate 3-to-1 to a more aggressive 10-to-1 or something a little smaller. And I think that's very important. Otherwise, I'm afraid that we won't be able to make as conclusive statements as we could with the cleaner proposal. The other issue that I wanted to touch on is the issue of confusion of customers. And I recently testified in 2 rate cases in Arizona, one for Tucson Electric Unisource and the other for Arizona Public Service. And there was a great deal of concern. These were general rate cases, not pilot projects, but there was a tremendous amount of discussion about time of use rates, and there are some big pilots that have been going on there with time of use rates for some time. And no one was really advocating to layer on tiers into those time of use rates. And the concern was communication to the customer and the customer's understanding of what happens when you get multiple variables going on with their bill. And I think that's particularly important with this pilot with customers who have new electric vehicles. We want them to use those vehicles without having something in their head saying, oh, I know that if I charge more and use it more, it will cost a little more. And that concerns me. While I don't have absolute statistics to back that up, it's got to be something of a psychological issue to a customer. They go in the garage, they have an electric vehicle and a gasoline vehicle. Which do I use? And if I know that it costs a little more to charge more and use more with the electric vehicle, that could impact what I do. So I think the confusion issue is a big one that we should avoid for the pilot. When we get to a general rate case eventually here, I think then we will need to carefully, very carefully, look at all of these issues and see what makes sense for all customers. I doubt that there will be any appetite for a separate rate class for electric vehicle owners, though that could happen. But, you know, if someone could switch rate classes by buying an electric vehicle, you don't want to create some gaming there. And I'm afraid if you had separate rate classes, that could happen. I think that, I mean, the idea of time of use rates with tiered rates is an interesting one. And if we had more money for this study, I would recommend that we do essentially what Rocky Mountain Power is proposing, and then also have 2 sets of customers that were on time of use with tier rates. Then we would get 2 sets for each of those types of rates. And then we could do some very good comparisons. But given that we have limited funds and we don't want to overspend the budget, I think it's much more prudent to select one of those types of rate structures and not try to mix and match. I think if we mix and match, we will have problems when we try to analyze this. So I believe that's all I would say in summary. Thank you.
And Mr. Wilson, I am going to ask you just one quick follow-up question. We have had 2 witnesses today, Ms. Murray with the office and Ms. Wright with Utah Clean Energy, reference your attachment A to this most recent exhibit. I believe it was WRA Exhibit 4.0, and that would be the Rocky Mountain Institute report. And they mentioned that in that report that there are some concerns regarding potential conservation impacts from time of use rates. Ms. Wright says that suggests that we need to better understand conservation price signals included in these rates, and that this was included in that report. Could you address the concerns that were raised by both of these witnesses today?
Yes. I mean, it is a very good question as to how to best design rates for electric vehicle users, and one day we may be going back to advocating for heating with electricity instead of natural gas. But without a larger study, meaning more groups of customers on different rate classes, I just don't see how we can get at what we would need to get at to really understand how energy efficiency is impacted by different time of use type rate structures. Further, Western Resource Advocates has been studying the issues of rate structures for several years, looking at time of use, looking at demand charges. And while we know that the Regulatory Assistance Project has said that there is some additional advantage in energy efficiency, in saving energy from having time of use plus layering on a tier, we're pretty convinced at Western Resource Advocates that we will get a lot of energy efficiency from simple time of use rates, that customers will become very aware of when they're using energy, and that will cause them to reduce their overall energy use. And that's been the discussion in Arizona in these other cases, that you do get a lot of savings. Maybe eventually there are other ways to get even more, but we think that simple is better going forward at this time.
Mr. Wilson, does that conclude the summary of your position today?
It does.
Do you have any other recommendations for the commissions that are not included in your testimony?
I do not.
Does that conclude your summary?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson is available for cross.
Mr. Solander?
No questions, thank you.
Mr. Jetter?
I actually do have just a few brief questions. And this was actually regarding to the issue that we had you had mentioned earlier, which is in your rebuttal testimony on page 5. There's a chart that is included from a Rocky Mountain Institute report, and if I don't know if you have that in front of you.
I do.
Is your copy by chance in color?
It is.
Okay. So there's a combination of green and blue points on that chart. And as I understand that, and is it correct that the blue points to the right are based on a modified time-based rate, which are, I think the report described it as supercritical high load hours that typically fall between 5 and 22 days per year?
Yes, that's my understanding.
And kind of where I'm going with this question is, if we look on that chart down to the 10-to-1 peak to off-peak ratio, that's pretty much exclusively into the territory of those sort of critical on-peak rates, and there are no standard time of use pricing, or the clean time of use pricing with that extreme of a ratio. Is that right?
Yes, that's my understanding, at least from the data that was used to create this chart.
Okay. And if this chart is, I guess what I'm kind of follow up with that would be that it sounds like my understanding is it correct that your recommendation would be that the 10-to-1 rate would be a little bit on the extreme end, and somewhere more like 5-to-1 would be more appropriate for the second option.
Well, I think, as Mr. Meredith said, we want to keep the difference between the two options strong enough so that we get a clear signal as to the difference in customer behavior. I think 6-to-1 or 7-to-1 would probably be adequate, but we're kind of basing it on studies, as you point out, that are not identical to what we're doing. In my rebuttal, I said that this chart was not based on an electric vehicle time of use studies. It was based on just general user. So we don't really know how the electric vehicle users will fall on this chart. And as I said a few minutes ago, that's why I'd love to see 2 points rather than just 1 point. And you've pointed out that there is another variable in this chart that makes it a little less applicable to what we're actually doing, and that is that the blue dots on the chart are from critical peak pricing prices and other things. But what I was really doing was using this chart to kind of indicate how much of a difference does it take in prices to get reaction from the customer. And I think that's more interesting than when those prices were available. It's just the absolute difference in the prices. And so while you have certainly a valid point there, I was more interested in just the absolute difference in the peak to off-peak ratio. And there are a lot of things happening with this curve. I don't think Rocky Mountain Institute captured all of that in their discussion, because you could, if you throw out some of the points that are way off scale, I think you come up with some different, a little bit different analysis than they did. But maybe to summarize, I think it's a reasonable kind of guide to look at.
Okay. Well, thank you. And following up just a little bit on that, which is kind of what I'm trying to kind of tease out here just a little bit, is it seems, at least from that chart, that other utilities that were studied here typically don't go beyond about 4-to-1 in actual rates. And 10-to-1 is beyond, it looks like, anything that they had come up with in their study. Do you think it would be reasonable to have a second time of use rate that is beyond the limit of what would be reasonable to try to actually implement in an actual rate that's open to all customers?
Well, this is not, we're looking at a pilot, not a general rate case. And I'm sure that if this was a general rate case, I would be analyzing this in a different way and probably advocating differently. But given that it's a pilot, I really keep going back to statistical significance. We need a big enough differential that we actually get something meaningful at the end of the study. And I mean, it may be that even at 3-to-1, customers really shift their charging pattern, but it may not. And it could be that the charging pattern shift for 3-to-1 is not much different from 4-to-1 or even 5-to-1. That's why we need a bit of a spread. And I think 6-to-1 would be the smallest I would recommend for option 2.
Okay. Thank you. That's all the questions I had. I appreciate your time.
Mr. Snar?
Thank you. You indicated that certain aspects of the time of use rate pilot study here in Utah provides opportunities for study that may not have been studied in other states. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, you also referenced this Rocky Mountain Institute paper where certain things have been studied in other states. And indeed, on page 28, you've been referencing it, that captures some of the information from other studies that have been made, at least as it relates to incorporating differentials in time of use rates. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you've referenced in your testimony some of those conclusions, conclusions related to the 10-to-1 ratio, conclusions related to the 5-to-1 ratio, and conclusions with respect to the 2-to-1 ratio. Is that right?
That's correct.
And so a study focused on different differentials is basically repeating what you've already got resourced here in your Rocky Mountain Institute study. Is that correct?
Not with electric vehicles, no. But with studies that were not directed at just general energy users, then this is a better guide.
Do you suspect that the conclusions reached in the Rocky Mountain Institute paper with respect to users generally on time of use rates would significantly differ from electric vehicle users?
I don't know, and that's what I would like to know.
Okay. Isn't it true that there's not been a study that you're aware of that compares a time of use rate with another time of use rate having tiered or inclining blocks?
I think there has been some of that, but I haven't seen the data. I've heard, I mean, I've listened to several RAP webinars, and that's the rate, well, RAP. And we actually hired one of their people to consult with us on rate design a bit, and I kind of remember there have been some results, but I don't have access to that data offhand.
Now, you were referencing studies to be meaningful. If we studied two different ideas or two different points of information that were somewhat the same, the study might not be effective because we couldn't see the difference. Is that right?
That you wouldn't, yes, correct. You would not get a statistically significant difference between the two, so you kind of wasted one of your points.
But with respect to general usage and the information you've provided here out of the page 28 of the Rocky Mountain Institute, the effect of the rate differential has been studied and somewhat has an answer, as you've played out in your testimony. Isn't that true?
Yes, I mean, the higher the differential in general, the more shifting of energy to off-peak from on-peak, yes. I think we could conclude that.
So if we were to put forth a study opportunity here in the state of Utah with this electric vehicle program, where we were studying one time of use rate involved, which incorporates a particular rate differential that seems to be the best candidate, as you've recommended, out of the Rocky Mountain Institute, and on the other hand studied a time of use rate that has tiers, wouldn't that provide a great opportunity to study these two different concepts and to see whether or not there is a difference in how the two rates would compare?
No, I disagree with that. As I said, if we could add two more groups of customers to this study, then we could do that, and I would be comfortable, very comfortable. That would be a great study. But if we're limited to essentially three groups, the control and option 1 and option 2, then I would disagree with that. I think it either has to be a clean time of use for both of option 1 and option 2, or it has to be tiered plus time of use for both of them, which I don't find as valuable because I think there's confusion between which of those variables is really causing the shift.
With respect to confusion, you've studied the rebuttal of Utah Clean Energy witness Sarah Wright, isn't that true?
Yes.
And isn't it true that her current proposal only really has two TOU rate alternatives, one with tiers and one without?
Yes.
And with respect to the one with tiers, there would be 4 different energy rates stated for service throughout the year, isn't that correct?
Yes.
And isn't it true that the currently applicable residential customer rates includes tiers?
Yes.
And with respect to those tiers, isn't it true that there's 3 different energy rates that apply during the summer?
Yes.
And Rocky Mountain has not proposed any rate design features that would encourage conservation for off-peak periods where those electric vehicles are given special lower rates to encourage their vehicles, to charge their vehicles. Isn't that correct? Do you want me to restate that?
Please.
Rocky Mountain has not proposed any rate design features that would encourage conservation for off-peak time periods where those with electric vehicles are given special lower rates to charge their vehicles. Isn't that correct?
Best of my knowledge, that's correct.
And if the TOU pilot program were to include one rate option that included tiered or inclining block rates, isn't it true that that would allow the usage patterns to be studied more directly as it relates to whether charging vehicles in off-peak periods would encourage habits that might be inconsistent with energy conservation?
Well, as I said, if we had 2 more options, it would be a great idea, but I think the mix and match, we're going to look at apples and oranges.
But the mix and match, as you suggest, would remove any opportunity to observe the results as it relates to possible measures to encourage conservation. Isn't that correct?
Well, we're going, I wouldn't quite agree with that, because we will have a set of customers on the existing rates, which have the tiered rates. So we will get to see what the difference is between those. We wouldn't see how time of use impacts that, but as I said, we just don't have enough options to throw at that.
But if you have three rates, one that's got tiers over here, two that have time of use opportunities for service over here, wouldn't changing one of those time of use rates to a tiered option allow us to observe both the possible impacts of switching to a different lower rate differential, and also switching to a rate with a lower rate, but also including the tiers? Doesn't three rates allow us to observe two different features and study them?
No, because, I mean, as you said, the current rate actually has three different tiers, so that's different. And then we have one clean time of use, and then a time of use with tiers, and so we really have three different. You got apples, oranges, and pineapples or something.
I have no further questions.
Mr. Meekum? Ms. Hayes?
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Wilson. So I'm going to turn back to your graph on page, well, I guess it's the graph from the RMI report on page 5 of your testimony. Excuse me. And you, just to follow up on what Mr. Jetter was saying, you were really focused on the green dots. Is that correct?
No, I was looking at the whole set. Actually, if they weren't colored, that's kind of how if they were all gray, that's kind of how I was looking at them, just to see the spread of peak to off-peak and what that did to move customer behavior.
Okay, but in the current, the proposals that we're contemplating for this pilot program, we're really only considering what in this report they would consider the time of use price only. Is that correct? Because we're not considering critical peak pricing, peak time rebates, or variable peak pricing. Is that correct?
Correct in as you ask it, but we are looking at spread. What's the significance of the spread? Which takes into account, in my view, all of the dots.
Sure. Okay. Do you know how many of the studies represented in any of these dots examined tiered time of use rates?
No, I don't know.
Okay. Do you know how many of these studies represented in the dots evaluated technology-enabled devices?
No, I don't know that.
All right. Let's talk about electric vehicles for a minute. With an electric vehicle, you can program the car to begin charging at a set time. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And that's true of the vehicle itself, regardless of the type of charger. Is that correct?
Yes, it's a property of the vehicle in general.
Okay. So in other words, the electric vehicle is what's called a technology-enabled device. Is that correct?
It is, though I know there are chargers that do have those kinds of capabilities as well.
Sure. But the cars themselves are technology-enabled devices.
Well, certainly. And to my best of my knowledge, most or all of them do have the ability to program your charging.
Yeah. Will you turn with me to page 42 of the RMI report?
Actually don't have it here.
Oh, I think Okay, if it's all right, Ms. Wright has a copy of page
Sure.
42 of the report.
Sure.
She can bring to you.
Is that in the record somewhere to which you could?
Yes.
Do you want a copy? I have a copy if you'd like.
I can pull it up here. Introduced with the rebuttal.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's attachment A to exhibit WRA 4.0.
Thank you.
So if you look at that graph on the left,
Excuse me, could you repeat which page?
oh, page 42.
Sorry, I didn't have
Oh,
That's what I thought.
okay. I'm looking at page 42 of that RMI report.
Okay.
So this graph on the left, which shows peak reduction for basic time-based rates with and without enabling technology. So the lighter blue shows time of use rates along with technology-enabled devices. So looking at that graph, would you agree with me that much higher savings, for example, more than double, were achieved with technology-enabled devices plus time of use rates than with time of use rates alone?
Yes, but looking at this again, the curve is actually steeper on the price enabling technologies curve, which means that it's actually more important to have a larger peak to off-peak ratio
Well,
with
but-
enabling technology.
I mean, but there are results that show that even at a 3-to-1, around a 3-to-1 ratio, there were significant savings. Would you agree?
Oh, certainly,
All right.
certainly. But there are even more savings at 6 and 7 to 1 by a significant amount, like 50% or more.
Thank you. So, will you turn with me to page 81 of the Rocky Mountain Institute report?
Yes, I'm there.
Okay, I'm not. One moment. Well, will you, this page 81 lists some conclusory recommendations. Would you read those first two paragraphs?
Into the record or
Yeah.
myself? So the first two bullet points?
No, it's just that introductory paragraph and then that first bullet point.
Oh. Starting at going forward? I just want to make sure I'm,
Let me see. I think so. I think I have misplaced my page 81, but yeah, going forward, exactly. Thank you.
okay, so this is the research takeaways from this paper. Going forward, there are significant knowledge gaps related to both time-based and demand charge rates that the industry and researchers should address. Specific topics that emerged through this work include, and then I'll read the first one, evaluate rate impacts on total energy consumption. The majority of studies that have considered customers' behavioral response to alternative rates have evaluated the impacts on customer peak reduction, but very few evaluated the impacts on total energy consumption. Regardless of whether the intent of a time-based or demand charge rate is to impact total energy consumption, this is a critical consideration, and the rate's effect is important to understand.
Thank you. So, isn't Utah Clean Energy proposing to evaluate with its tiered rate option an evaluation of total energy consumption in addition to peak shifting relative to consumption and peak shifting under a non-tiered rate option?
Well, that's certainly the desire of Utah Clean Energy, and
Yeah.
I just have the concerns I've expressed already.
Sure. No further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Hayes. I just have one. Mr. Wilson, you suggested several times that there would be value in comparing 2 points, correct?
Correct.
So regardless of what ultimately happens with respect to option 2, there will be value in comparing the control group against the customers who participate under option 1. Is that right?
Yes, there's some value to that.
Could we do anything with respect to option 2 that would interfere with the utility of those results?
No, I've thought about that, and I guess to me, if we go with the option 2 that has the tiered rates, it just, I think, would lack meaning to me. And it would just be unfortunate. We would still have the results that you said.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Ms. Gardner, anything else?
Yes, just a few clarifying questions, please.
Okay.
Mr. Wilson, we've heard a little bit today, both from exhibits that were submitted in this docket as well as live testimony regarding some research that has been done not only by the Rocky Mountain Institute, but also by the Regulatory Assistance Project, correct?
Yes.
And in both of those reports, we understand that there's been at least one study that we've been made aware of where they've looked at a combined time of use plus tiered rate. Is that correct? If I need to rephrase, let me know.
Yeah, please.
Okay. So is it true that from the Regulatory Assistance Project presentation that they do provide some results from a case study where they looked at a time of use plus tiered rate design?
Yes, I believe they have.
Okay. And it sounds like, based on the questioning we just received from Utah Clean Energy, that the Rocky Mountain Institute also says that there is some value to be gleaned from looking at energy consumption with these rate designs. Correct?
Oh, certainly, yes.
Okay. Now, one of the reasons you chose to use this data from the Rocky Mountain Institute was simply to show the different types of rate differentials that are used in time of use rate designs. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And is it true that based on your opinion of those study results that you find that somewhere in the 6 to 1 or 7 to 1 differential is appropriate for this particular pilot?
Yes, and you know what, if you had, the best of all worlds, you would add a whole bunch of options and do 3 to 1, 4 to 1, 5 to 1, 6 to 1, and you could create a very nice curve for Utah. And you could do the same with time of use plus tiered rates if you had the ability to do many more options. And of course, as an engineer and scientist, I'd love to see that, but I understand the practical, constrictions on that. So, I'm kind of advising to go with the best case that we have.
And Mr. Wilson, isn't it true that the Rocky Mountain Institute results on differentials did not look at electric vehicle time of use pilots specifically, right?
To the best of my knowledge, they didn't look at any electric vehicle pilots.
So would you agree that this opportunity that we've been afforded by Rocky Mountain Power's proposed electric vehicle pilot project is a unique one for the state of Utah to compare the impacts of two different time of use rates with varying differentials and how those rates will impact customer behavior?
Absolutely, for the reasons I've already stated.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. No further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. You're excused.
Thank you.
I have one additional question, just a point of inquiry. Is there anywhere in the filed testimony of Mr. Wilson or others that's referencing this regulatory assistant project?
It's the exhibit attached to Ms. Wright's direct testimony.
Okay, thank you.
That was Sophie Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Anything else, Ms. Gardner?
Nothing further. Thank you.
Thank you. Do any of the parties have anything else to add before we adjourn? Seeing no hands and hearing nothing, we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.